It's my Nerd World, and welcome to it, a Star Wars podcast. I'm glad you're with the show this week. There is nothing going on news-wise. Like nothing. I mean, maybe some information about the Dr. Aphra audiobook. But other than that, there's been no major news this week, but that doesn't mean we still can't talk about all things great when it comes to Star Wars. So, for the main topic this week, we're actually going to go back several episodes to a listener email who had a topic suggestion request. I'll give you my subjective thoughts on common sequel trilogy complaints, what I believe are the Star Wars fandom's two biggest problems, everything to love about the sequel trilogy, and then we'll get into some listener feedback. Remember, the show is brought to you by mynerdworld.net. That's the website, mynerdworld.net. You can find out about all things related to this podcast, the EMBARK science fiction space opera series. There's brand new concept art available at mynerdworld.net. Also, while you're there, you can check out a brand new daily blog. I'm writing things daily. It ain't much, but it's something. If you want to hear my daily musings, you can go to mynerdworld.net. In the meantime, let's get to today's show. I'm so glad you're with a Star Wars podcast this week.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you.
My Nerd World.
Just let it in.
It is a Star Wars podcast, and I'm your host, Jon Justice. Glad you're with the show this week. I hope that my Nerd World can provide you with a distraction and a little bit of sanity in the middle of an insane world that we currently live in right now. So there's not a lot of news going on this week. I mentioned that earlier. And I've been holding on to a couple of emails from you that have reached out to the show. And I'm going to go off of, for the next few weeks, barring some significant Star Wars news coming out of Disney and Lucasfilm, go off of some of your suggestions for the main topic on the show. I do want to mention that there is a brand new email address. So I will still be taking email to TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. But I have a brand new Gmail address. If you'd like to use it, it's the Jon Justice, John, Jon, thejohnjustice@gmail.com. I just realized when it comes to not just the podcast, but also my being an author in promoting the books that I'm writing, it would probably be better to have a more specific identifier for an email address. So I'm going with thejohnjustice at gmail.com. You can use that or talkshownerd@gmail.com. If you haven't signed up for the mailing list yet, I am growing the mailing list. The mailing list is something that I will remind you who listen to the show or read the EMBARK books about promotions coming up, sales that may be going on with the books, things happening with the podcast. I will not spam you. It's just a way that I can connect with you and let you know that if you enjoy reading the stories that I'm writing or you enjoy listening to the podcast and you want to be the first to know about particular things happening with all things My Nerd World, then join the mailing list. For example, I just sent out an email to the mailing list this past week, letting everybody know about what was happening with the audiobook for Book 3, The Vanishing War. It has been submitted to Audible, so I'll let you know now, but the email list got a preview. It has been submitted to Audible. I'm simply waiting for their approval, and then I'll let everybody know when it's available for sale. Also, I sent out a piece of the cover art for Book 4. I did finish Book 4 in the EMBARK series just yesterday. And the editing process will begin. I'm really excited about this fourth entry into the EMBARK science fiction series. This is going to be sort of a spin-off side story taking place directly after the events of Book 3, but it promises to be a big departure. Still science fiction, still space opera-y, but it is going to be a big departure from the 3 previous books that I've written, and I'll give you a few more details on that a little bit later on in the show. But for the main topic this week, we're going to double back to an email that I received about a month or so ago from friend of the show and listener Cortana. And she wrote this. Hi, John. I just want to say that I really love the show and appreciate your positivity about Star Wars in the midst of this toxic fandom. I have one question. Are you ever going to do a podcast episode defending the sequel trilogy as a whole and addressing common criticisms of it, such as it's a carbon copy of the original trilogy, it doesn't work as a trilogy, and stuff like JJ threw Ryan's ideas out the window to restore his original vision? Thank you so much, Cortana. So I've done this quite a bit on the show, and what I'm going to do this week is I'm going to continue to sort of tackle this question and some of the common criticism out there of the sequel trilogy by providing you my subjective thoughts, not just about the sequel trilogy, but also the fandom as well. And hopefully point out some things that I have not pointed out on the show before when talking about the sequel trilogy. After that, we will dive into... I got a list. I put together a list of things that I love about the sequel trilogy, in case you're curious. Also want to hear from you, the Jon Justice at gmail.com. And then we'll get into some listener feedback this week. Not a lot. There's a lot going on in the world. I know people are busy, but we do have a couple of emails that we'll share this week. So let's dive into what Cortana had asked, right? Do a podcast defending the sequel trilogy as a whole and addressing some of the common criticisms of the sequel trilogy. If you've listened to the show at all before, you know that I do love the sequel trilogy. I love what Disney and Lucasfilm has done with all of the films that they've released. They are very much on par with the other saga films that came before Disney bought Lucasfilm from George Lucas, in as much as none of them are perfect. Some of them are closer to perfect, subjectively speaking, than others. They all sort of have their flaws, and depending on when films were released, they're going to be viewed a little differently for a number of different factors. Right now, any film that gets released is going to be subjected to a level of criticism and commentary that we've never seen before prior to social networking. I mean, that really is the world that we live in right now. I don't think, unless for some reason social networking is turned off tomorrow, I don't see how that will be changing anytime at all in the future. We live in a world now where you can instantly go and voice your opinion or have your opinion have affirmation on a particular opinion, and it can spread far and wide. It can go viral easier than it ever has been in the past. So this brings me to the first point that I want to make in addressing what Cortana asked, and that is, in my opinion, the two biggest problems that Star Wars suffers in the fandom currently. There are more, but these are, in my view, the two biggest issues that we have within the fandom. First off, we have the issue of nostalgia. Those old enough, and this is generational to each particular piece of content coming out. So for me, being 47 years old, I go all the way back to the original trilogy, right? And the sense of nostalgia that I feel for the original trilogy. And what's fascinating, in my opinion, about that is, and I don't know if this is the experience for other individuals for other men and women that are my age who grew up with the Star Wars, franchise, or Star Wars genre. I mean, it really is a genre at this point in time. But for me, the nostalgia part of Star Wars extends far beyond Star Wars at an early age. What I mean by that is I was a fan of Star Wars before I was a fan of anything else. And therefore, because my world as a young 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old was dominated by Star Wars and the original trilogy and how popular it was back then, there are numerous things that sort of circulate in from that same time period that remind me of Star Wars that are not Star Wars related. So, like, for example, there's a song, Steal Away, that's sort of yacht rock music, right? When I hear that, I'm reminded of my nostalgic feelings for Star Wars. That song along with like Doobie Brothers that my father used to listen to when I was younger. Those songs, when I hear, Old Black Water, when I hear particular songs from that era, I actually get nostalgic Star Wars feelings because those songs came out around that time, and that was the thing that I was most into. Things don't really change all that much. On top of that, the Star Wars-related nostalgia. I've wiped out on watching a 45-minute YouTube video that is nothing but old commercials from the original trilogy for the toys of Star Wars from Kenner. They're old Kenner commercials. I found a Pinterest page that is nothing but old advertisements and ads taken from comic books and JCPenney magazines. That's my nostalgia. So getting back to the two biggest problems that Star Wars suffers from the fandom is, one, this nostalgia factor that's generational. So for people like me, it's the original trilogy. For people years older, it ends up being the prequel trilogy. For other individuals, it ends up being the Clone Wars. And I think over a long enough timeline, obviously, there are going to be a group of fans out there that will be nostalgic for the sequel trilogy because that was their trilogy. Unfortunately, right, and this is all the desire, and this all comes down to the nostalgia, the desire to feel the way that they did when they first experienced Star Wars. And so why this is an issue is I think for a lot of people, they get so wrapped up in the nostalgia part of it that if a Star Wars film or a piece of content does not deliver on those nostalgic feelings, then there is a sense of betrayal involved. Now, again, if you don't like the sequel trilogy, and these things don't apply to you, I'm not talking about you. So, try to make the choice, because it is a choice, to not be offended by certain things, right? I understand a lot of people do not like the sequel trilogy, or they like parts of the sequel trilogy, but not other parts of the sequel trilogy. And that is totally cool and up to the individual because art is subjective, right? These are just my subjective views. And there is no right answer to any of this. So on top of the nostalgia factor, those who have a desire to feel the way that they did when they first experienced Star Wars, whatever year that might have been, and they don't get it, and there's a level of frustration there, right? And then you have the social media aspect of it that drives all of this. You could these are interchangeable between 1 and 2, right? Because I think one feeds the other and the other feeds the one. But social media affirmation, headcanon, and the negativity that breeds negativity. The amount of money that can be gained from producing negative Star Wars content over positive Star Wars content, right? It's just true. People gravitate towards the negative. People want to have their feelings, again, sort of confirmed, and that affirmation that's involved, the headcanon that spreads to the point where if you don't get what you wanted to get in a particular film, and that was certainly the case for a segment of the fandom when it comes to The Rise of Skywalker, then that negativity spreads and that negativity breeds on social media. All right. So I wanted to kind of get the negative stuff out of the way because I wanted to establish in moving forward with this email suggested topic to lay out again sort of my thoughts on where a lot of that negativity, the majority of the negativity derives from. And that's the nostalgia factor and then the social media that breeds the headcanon, the affirmation, and the negativity. All right. So let's get into the specific questions that Cortana asked. And one, right, in defending the sequel trilogy, addressing common criticisms. The first one that she lists here is it's a carbon copy of the original trilogy. Okay, again, my view on that, hardly. And let me explain. The Force Awakens is the outlier in that, right? I think it was Eckhart's Ladder on YouTube, I believe. It's a fantastic YouTube channel. Don't agree with everything that he says, but really do enjoy a vast majority of his videos. I believe he did or somebody else did, went and laid out how the Force Awakens is kind of a combination of all three original trilogy movies. And I think to a certain extent that is true. I think that there is quite a bit to be said about that. And I think there is debate about whether or not The Force Awakens was essentially a soft reboot, if that was kind of the subtext intention. Now, that being said, this is why I don't think that it's a carbon copy. Certainly not the trilogy as a whole. Not even close. But let's stick with The Force Awakens, since that's the one that has the most elements compared to the original trilogy. While you have a super weapon, and we'll get to that in there, while you have the discovery of another young individual on a desert planet, right? It's not like George Lucas didn't do that same thing with the Phantom Menace, right? But here's where it deviates and why the entire sequel trilogy is not a carbon copy of the original trilogy. And it's the core story of the dyad. And that is an entirely different story altogether. I love this concept of the dyad. And I pray that at some point Disney and Lucasfilm go and explore that idea for future films. There's the line from Palpatine that I'm sure I'm getting wrong, but it goes something to the extent of, when Palpatine discovers that Ben and Rey are a dyad, it's a power not seen for generations. I would love to see that concept advanced further. And that's where it deviates to me. That was set up very cleverly, very almost subconsciously. Of course, there were a lot of keen observers, even people that I didn't necessarily agree with, that actually got it right when it comes to that connection between Kylo Ren, Ben Solo, and Rey. And of course, this led to a lot of controversy and frustration when the story was wrapped up in The Rise of Skywalker, and we'll get into that. But this was not a story at its core that was about a particular hero's journey and then family matters of the father. This was a particular hero's journey and the connection within the Force that they had with somebody else who was also a part of this much larger storytelling from the original 6 films. That's why I really appreciate and like the Palpatine connection to Rey when everything is said and done. It really did set this apart. This idea that Ben Solo, was the daughter, right, of these two powerful individuals, particularly this one powerful individual of being a Luke Skywalker and being a Skywalker, and then here was Rey, who was a direct, descendant individual who was attached to the ultimate evil that they've been battling against. I thought that was an incredibly smart, unique, and original take on what those first 6 films did. I mean, there's a big difference here, too, right? Because those first 6 films were essentially about that Anakin Skywalker story that leads to Luke Skywalker. And that's a very difficult thing moving forward to be Disney and Lucasfilm to look at what George Lucas had laid out and be like, okay, how do we do another 3 movies spinning off of that? They had to sort of ride this delicate balance of keeping the original trilogy characters while bringing in these new characters, and I thought they did a fantastic job. The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker both, right, have those poetry elements, as George would say. All the films do. The parts of the films that rhyme and that are uniquely Star Wars, right? The Force Awakens was a little bit more direct about it, right? Was a little more above board. But The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker both took those things that George did riffs on them. Little things like in The Last Jedi when Kylo Ren spins his TIE silencer when he is attacking the Resistance ship at the beginning before his mom, gets blown out into space and uses the Force to come back. Things like that. The entire Walker scene at the end of The Last Jedi and the facing off against the ski speeders. I mean, obviously evoking what took place at the start of The Empire Strikes Back. And all the films do that. I mean, I could, again, spend the whole rest of the show doing the comparisons of the threads between the films and how they all, like poetry, it rhymes, like George Lucas would say. Again, pointing out to why it's not a carbon copy, but it is more of a true extension, in my opinion, the sequel trilogy is, of the saga films that came before it. The question of it doesn't work as a trilogy. In, again, my opinion, how doesn't it work as a trilogy? It's subjective, but I fail to see how any issue, of it as a trilogy doesn't work. It's unique in as much as The Last Jedi picks up right after The Force Awakens, so that is different, obviously. We actually have more of a almost, 5-hour film if you were to watch them all the way through. That being said, the three stories do flow together very, very well. Rian Johnson's, film The Last Jedi is going to be, I'll continue to say this, it's going to be very, very important moving forward for Star Wars. Star Wars and the fandom, for as toxic as it's become, and how that even ended up extending into a lot of the feedback and the controversy around The Rise of Skywalker, and specifically the treatment of Ben Solo, right? That being said, you got to go through those growing pains. You got to do something different. You got to push the envelope. And Rian Johnson, in a masterful way, pushed the envelope. I know people hate it. People are still talking about it. Just now, I saw a thread talking about somebody defending The Last Jedi and Rian Johnson's treatment of Luke Skywalker. And that thread is blown up. People still to this day, even after years of it being released, in the middle of everything that's going on in the world, people still take time to go and argue about The Last Jedi. And in my opinion, that's a good thing. You got to be challenged. You got to push the limits. Right? That's how you compare and contrast moving forward. That's how we can grow Star Wars, and directors can feel the desire to be bold. I love The Mandalorian. I've been watching The Mandalorian as of late, taking a bit of a break from watching the films, although I did sneak in a viewing of The Rise of Skywalker in the middle of the week. But for as much as I love The Mandalorian, we're not breaking any new ground on that. We're breaking ground technology-wise. I think it's fantastic what they've been able to do if you've been watching the Mandalorian gallery shows, and the volume and what they can do on these stages with these massive screens. I think that the Star Wars storytelling is going to be fantastic for years to come because of the ability that they have to make realistic movie quality live action shows, and eventually be using that technology on films as well. But The Mandalorian really isn't going and pushing the limits and breaking any new ground. It's really good for what it is, and I think that Jon Favreau, the showrunner there, has done a great job of tapping into the things that influenced George Lucas. But what I like about the sequel trilogy is that it's not J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson necessarily being influenced by the things that influenced George Lucas. They were influenced by George Lucas, so they're doing their version of what they like about Star Wars. And the characters grow, right? To this idea that the trilogy doesn't work. No, the characters grow through all these films. And Rian Johnson's whole point of The Last Jedi was to put those main characters through their paces. Let them face difficult tasks. And he does that. He does that great. I know people don't like it, but I do. I think that when it comes to John Boyega's character and Finn in The Last Jedi, that is a really solid B-plot story. And a really fun adventure all on its own with colorful characters and amazing scenes. And we'll talk a little bit more about the things that I love about that later on. To the question of Rian Johnson throwing JJ's ideas out, J.J. Abrams never wrote an Episode 8 The Last Jedi script or treatment. So the ideas stopped for JJ when the credits rolled on The Force Awakens. Maybe J.J. Abrams would have done something different with Luke Skywalker. He didn't say that he was going to. Han and Leia were split up. Luke was frustrated and isolated on his own. It's kind of a 50-50 shot. Is he there to continue his own training and become a better Jedi, or he's there isolating himself? And Rian Johnson went with the challenging one, isolating himself. This idea that Rian Johnson threw J.J. Abrams' ideas out, it doesn't really even exist because you don't really know what J.J. Abrams' ideas were. He set up the characters up until this point. Luke's on the island. What do you think, Rian Johnson, that Luke's doing on the island? And Rian Johnson went with it. And again, the core story of Rey, nobody who will become Rey Skywalker, and Ben Solo in his wrestling with his alter identity of Kylo Ren is at the core of the story. J.J. Abrams and Lawrence Kasdan came up with that. J.J. Abrams and Chris Terrio expanded on it in the dyad, and Rian Johnson and what he did with the connectivity of those two characters of Rey and Ben Solo / Kylo Ren in The Last Jedi, planted all those, grew the seeds that J.J. Abrams planted in Episode 7. right? And then it was absolutely kept true in The Last Jedi, the seeds that were planted in 7. And then in The Rise of Skywalker, J.J. Abrams and Chris Terrio, they take that and they run with it, and they bring about this other part of Joseph Campbell's mythology with this dyad, these two individuals becoming one, and I love that theme. You know, then you have the people that are upset who say that J.J. threw out Rian Johnson's ideas, right? Then you go the other way. And then you have the individuals, and again, it's all subjective. If you think that he did, that's cool with you, but I don't. Rian didn't write an episode 9 treatment. Rian Johnson put those characters through their paces, and then the credits rolled after Broom Boy, and it was time for somebody else to go and pick up the baton. Perhaps Rian Johnson would have done something different, and he had written the last movie, but he didn't. Rian Johnson didn't write a treatment for 9. So J.J. Abrams then took what Rian Johnson did, building on what J.J. Abrams did, and then created something rad in The Rise of Skywalker with it. All right, so this brings me to this part of the show this week.
Something inside me has always been there. But now it's awake. And I need help.
With so much anger in the world today, we live in complaint culture in the world today, right? And so much hate. Here's a list of things from the sequel trilogy that I love. In no particular order, I just basically this morning, having my cup of coffee, I sat down and was doing some work on book 4 and thought, okay, let's set up for the podcast this week. And I wrote down things that I love about all 3 of these films in no particular order. This is not the complete list, just things that stuck out that I wanted to share with you. The Falcon TIE Fighter chase at the start of The Force Awakens is badass. I love that action sequence. J.J. Abrams' ability to... And George Lucas did this too, in my opinion. But J.J. Abrams' ability to capture a particular moment and direct the actor's body language is top-notch. Some of those moments when Rey is barreling towards the wrecked and crashed TIE Fighter and she slams the control stick sideways on the Millennium Falcon, and pitches it just at the last moment. Moments like that, when she drops out of the sky, cuts the engines, allows the Falcon to fall so that Finn can go and line up his shot. Scenes like that are so exciting, never get boring, and are just amazing, absolutely amazing to me. Things that I love about the sequel trilogy. The moment when Rey crinkles her nose at Han on Takodana, when Han's talking about hiring her, and she says she needs to go back to Jakku, and Han expresses his dismay and says, Chewie's going to be sad, he kind of likes you. And Rey does this little nose crinkle as they go walking up to Maz Kanata's castle. It's just such a smile-inducing, fun little moment in the middle of this space opera. The Resistance arriving on Takodana, the X-wing fighters spitting up the water, in the wake of in their thruster wake. Very inspirational for me when I was writing book 2. When I was writing Treasure in Darkness, and to a certain extent also book 3. There's some elements that I really loved of that moment, and then that dogfight that took place in The Force Awakens. The Kylo Rey Force Connection standoff after Rey is taken into custody. Well, the moment when when Kylo Ren knocks out Rey and he's holding her draped in his arms and taking him onto his command shuttle. I mean, very fairy tale fantasy, but again, just another great moment that I love. But that moment where these two individuals that are the core, the dyad, for the first time, we see these two connect. The fear in Kylo Ren, Ben Solo's face, and the shock and determination of Rey knowing that she's not powerless in all this. Just incredible storytelling. The assault on Starkiller Base. What I actually like about that is I felt that J.J. Abrams actually held back. He gave us a very interesting, different take on the attack on a superweapon, didn't fully go and engage and redo what had come before, but gave us something different. Gave us a little bit of a trench run, right? Again, the poetry when it rhymes, but then changed it up by having Kylo Ren fly into this blown-up portion of Starkiller Base, to erupt the whole thing to end up taking the planet out, and then the planet exploding, but turning back into a star because it sucked in a star. Just incredible, right? The Rey and Kylo Ren saber fight. Again, sort of to repeat what I just said a moment ago, I like the fact that The Force Awakens is very modern storytelling in terms of pacing. The movie just flies by. All of J.J. Abrams' movies do, in my opinion. But there's a minimal aspect of it that J.J. Abrams took great care, in my opinion, to bring forward in this soft reboot return of Star Wars that I think works really, really well in this film. Because it does feel very fresh. It is paced like a modern film, right? Faster than the original Star Wars, but it doesn't go overboard in diminishing anything that happened and came before it. And that's one of the things that actually J.J. Abrams also does in The Rise of Skywalker, and Rian Johnson does too. It's really fascinating to me that I actually feel like they did a better job of paying respect to the wonder that was the original trilogy by not overdoing things too much, so that we still see something very unique in each film. Where I feel like George Lucas with the prequel trilogy and his playing with technology. Let me back up. Let me say it this way. I think the sequel trilogy fits better with the aesthetic of the original trilogy than the prequel trilogy does with the aesthetic of the original trilogy. And I know that we're supposed to be seeing sort of the height of the Republic. Well, we're going to get that more in the books, right? But within the prequel trilogy. And so what we're seeing in the original trilogy is the galaxy at war and in turmoil. I get that. But just looking and viewing them, I feel like the flow between the sequel trilogy and the original trilogy is better in terms of consistency than the prequel trilogy. The hold on Rey's face, getting back to the things I love about the sequel trilogy and working through The Force Awakens. The hold on Rey's face, when Kylo Ren and Rey are clashing sabers, and the chasm is opening up behind them as Starkiller Base begins to fall apart, and she taps into the Force. That hold on her face when she figures it out it's movie magic. Her dark side showing after she lands a blow to Kylo Ren, and she's stalking him, right? And now you can sort of inject, knowing that she's a Palpatine, going back and watching that film, it takes on a completely new dynamic. Moving over to the things I love about the sequel trilogy and The Last Jedi, the entire opening set piece in the Last Jedi is fantastic. I love everything about that opening battle. I know some people take issue, and I think if it were me and I were working with Rian Johnson, I probably personally would have pitched off some of the more jokey joke stuff that Kylo Ren was ribbing Hux with. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't take it out of the film. I do look at it and go, does the film work without it? And I think, yeah, you could probably make that less dad jokey and have it work better. But as a whole, that entire opening sequence is just masterful. Everything was Snoke in his grand hall, working through the things that I love about the sequel trilogy. That red hall, the Praetorian guards, the weirdo people off to the side, the way that kind of sets the stage for what we end up seeing at the beginning of The Rise of Skywalker in retrospect. But all those moments, Hux, the arrival of Kylo Ren at the beginning of the film, and leading to Kylo Ren destroying his helmet, which is one of the moments that I love in the Last Jedi. But all of that, taking the ridiculous mask off, seeing Snoke for the first time, was again Star Wars magic. The first time I saw it, and every time that I've seen. Moving forward to the things I love about the sequel trilogy, every Rey and Kylo exchange. I love how minimalist it is. The choice that Rian Johnson made to really keep it intimate in those Skyping Force connection moments. The fact that he had both the actor and the actress on stage together during those scenes, which I also believe that Rian Johnson did for the Rise of Skywalker. Of course, this leads to the finger touch and loving scene, and we're going to double back to that because I want to make a point a little bit later on and expand upon that a little further. But every exchange between Rey and Kylo, or Ben when he's there, it's just fantastic. Rey versus Luke. This doesn't get talked about nearly as much in my view, but that moment after the finger touch and loving scene in the rain between Luke and Rey is really good, and it doesn't get talked about hardly at all. But that is a really great little exchange that they have. Dialogue, the action, the set pieces. But I really do, every time I watch the movie, I'm like, man, I forget how good this little moment is. And of course, everything that happens when Yoda shows up. The father chase on Canto Bight, and especially the score that attached with it, top notch, love it. My favorite part of the whole Canto Bight sequence. I could do without DJ's stutter. Again, it's a little quirky Rian Johnson thing, but I could have personally done without it. I think that character would have been better with just that little subtle change. But again, there's people that like it. That's more of a subjective thing. All of this is subjective. Rey and Ben versus the Praetorian Guards. I mean, that whole, again, everything that takes place inside Snoke Chambers. Rey's arrival there, going up the elevator, that entire battle. I've done a little, as the Rewatchables podcast and Bill Simmons would say, I've done a little picky nits on this before, but there are some moments in that Praetorian Guard fight where the choreography is a bit off, and it catches my eye. But that's very similar to the choreography that takes place in The Phantom Menace as well. And some of the issues that I have a little bit too choreographed in that final battle between Darth Maul, Qui-Gon Jinn, and Obi-Wan Kenobi. But everything with regard to the crate battle is so much fun. Chewie piloting the Falcon, Rey on the dorsal gun. I believe that's what it is. The gun underneath the ship, and that Falcon tie chase into those red crystal caverns on Crate. Again, does not get. It's a toss-up for me which sequence of the Falcon that I enjoy more. Right. As a matter of fact, the main Falcon sequences from all three films, whether it's the Falcon sequence from Jakku, the Jakku escape, the battle at Crate Falcon sequence going into the red crystal mines, or the opening sequence on the ice mines at the start of the Rise of Skywalker. All three of those Falcon sequences are just incredible, including the light speed skipping, which I love. Getting to the Rise of Skywalker, I could probably spend an hour on the Rise of Skywalker, but I'll try and give you my best instinctive reactions about the stuff that I love in that movie, because I truly do love every bit of it. Kylo Ren flying to Exegol, the score, the entire intro with Palpatine at the beginning, I think is great. There's little callbacks there to Snoke, seeing Snoke, spoiler alert, in some of those vats, seeing the Oculus. If you've ever noticed it, the Oculus that is on the Supremacy from The Last Jedi, there's a version of it that Kylo Ren stands in front of right before he meets Palpatine. That whole exchange with Palpatine and what can you give me, everything, the lightning crack to the Star Destroyers coming up out of Exegol. I mentioned this on last week's show. Again, if we're picking nits, stealing that from the Rewatchables podcast, if I'm nitpicking, I would have liked those Star Destroyers to come out of the ground opening via some chambers, right? Something a little bit more like coming out of factories. But the visual of the Star Destroyers and the fact that Star Wars does lend itself to visuals that you need to kind of explain in your head without having explained to you, especially having grown up with the original trilogy, I still think that's pretty rad, even though I would have liked to maybe have seen some lights showing up like in some of the concept art. The moment the team leaves, C-3PO, BB-8, Chewie, Finn, Poe, and Rey. The moment the team leaves Asian Kloss at the beginning of the film to head for Pisana, some of John Williams' best work in the score, the exchanges that they have getting on the Falcon, them leaving, classic Star Wars, going on an adventure together. I love the decision that J.J. Abrams and Chris Terrio made to have these individuals together. The dialogue between all of them, I'm jumping forward a bit, but every the exchanges of the friends, right? The writing between the team, the snake burrows on Pisana, the speeder chase, holding hands when they're hiding in the asteroid field before they head to Kijimi, the exchanges on Kijimi, all those moments of the friends together are just spectacular. Every Ben Kylo / Kylo Rey moment. What I love is that this trilogy did the same thing that the original trilogy did, and it built on new ideas. It didn't tear them down, in my opinion. It built on new ideas. So what I mean by that is, in the sequel trilogy, we get this Force connection, right? It's established face-to-face in the interrogation scene in The Force Awakens. It's then expanded upon in Episode 8, and then even further in 9, right? In the original trilogy, we have Obi-Wan Kenobi disappearing after being struck down by Vader. Where'd he go? And then we can hear his disembodied voice at the end guiding Luke. But then what happens? Well, we get to The Empire Strikes Back in Episode 5, and we see that he's a Force ghost. And then that gets expanded even further in Episode 6 with Return of the Jedi, in the same thing as Yoda passes away. And then we get more interaction with the Force Ghost. We got that same thing and that sort of growing of a new idea that's expanded upon when it comes to the dyad and the connection between Rey and Ben Solo, Kylo Ren. Every exchange between the two of them is dramatically more meaningful and emotional and relevant because of everything that happened in The Last Jedi, right? If the finger touch, okay, and I'm going to keep this clean, but I want to make a point here. The finger touch is sort of in Star Wars, in the sequel trilogy. It's as intimate as these two individuals can be. It makes them both. It makes Ben Solo, and I'm going to call him Ben Solo in that moment. It makes Ben Solo in that moment shudder. It makes Rey in that moment shudder. It brings Rey to tears, right? Rian Johnson has said as much, that this is as close to intimacy as you're going to get. You think about how those two individuals would feel facing off and meeting each other once again after experiencing something like that. I love that about Star Wars, and especially the sequel trilogy. The original trilogy did it too, but it tackled this idea of intimacy in a kid-friendly and non-explicit way. It plays by its own rules. So you can apply, to a certain extent, that connection between Ben Solo and Rey when their fingers touched, right, as the most intimate thing within Star Wars, right, that they could be sharing in that moment. You view the two of them through that lens when they begin to Force connect in The Rise of Skywalker, and it ends up bringing this depth and emotion and relevancy to those moments. And it makes it make an abundance of sense at the beginning of towards the beginning of The Rise of Skywalker, when Rey first has, after her training montage where Kylo kind of infiltrates her mind, but when they have that first exchange with Kylo Ren on his destroyer and Rey on the desert in Pisano, when it all goes dark and he has the mask on again, right? And she's like, I can see the cracks in your mask, serving a new master. You had a chance to take my hand. Why didn't you? You had a chance to kill me. Why didn't you? These two individuals, why aren't they immediately going at each other? Because there's conflict there. There's conflict between them. They shared the most intimate thing that those two individuals could share, and it shocked both of them, and they've now experienced this thing together, so they don't know what to make of each other. And, of course, the way that plays out moving forward in the film is it's done just in a very masterful yet delicate way that works 100% in my opinion. Getting back to the things I love about the Rise of Skywalker and the sequel trilogy, Zori Bliss. I just love Zori Bliss. I think that she did a fantastic job in creating that character, using her body language from being behind Zori Bliss's helmet, and the way that she would speak and shake her head and I think you're all right, and tilts her head. She brings a ton of character to an individual that's behind a mask. Kenny Baker did that with R2-D2. If you've ever seen any some early interviews with Kenny Baker, who was inside the R2-D2 costume until he passed away, he talked about how he was smiling, and when he was shaking the R2 the R2 unit around inside, and he was smiling because he had no way to emote physically, but he wanted to generate those positive feelings, and it shows through. And that absolutely takes place with the Zori Bliss character, which I just love. Rey versus Kylo Ren on the Death Star 2. It's just one of my favorite lightsaber battle. It's even surpassed now the Praetorian Guard fight from the Last Jedi. I love the choreography of it, the music of it, the moments when they're stopping each other's blades with the Force, and again, laying on top of that this emotional connection the two of them have. To the point where Kylo Ren is almost about to defeat her after she's whipped his butt so many times, and it takes the love of his mother to stop him from doing so before Rey goes and stabs him, but then heals him. I mean, all of it's just so moving. Rey's arrival to Exegol, to the finale, I love, but sort of particular moments. Rey flying, Luke bringing the X-wing out of the water on Ahch-To, Rey flying the X-wing fighter. I've mentioned this before. It brought me to tears when I first saw it. I wanted that so bad to see this character Rey that I love so much from the sequel trilogy flying one of my favorite vehicles from the original trilogy. Luke's signature ship. Her flying to Exegol when she arrives on Exegol, and some of the Star Destroyer officers on one of the flight decks mention, she's arrived. Like, they know. I love that idea that this is the talk among the Sith Eternal on Exegol, that they were expecting Rey to arrive because they were waiting for all this to happen. The arrival of the Resistance and the thousands of ships is just incredible. And again, the fact that J.J. Abrams didn't do a straight-up space battle, and I thought that was a very clever thing to do. And even though I complained initially about my desire to see something a little bit more linear in terms of a space battle, I can totally live with it right now, and I love what they did in The Rise of Skywalker because we have those amazing space battles that came before in Return of the Jedi and the attack on the Death Star. The Rise of Skywalker gives us something different, and at the end of A New Hope, that was the culmination. That was the main battle, right? You had the separate, fight prior to that with Vader and Obi-Wan, but that was the end. It was very minimalist. I like the fact that with The Rise of Skywalker, the space battle is, again, secondary to the conflict that's taking place on the actual planet. And now that I've seen it many times, there's so many just individual moments and some of the slow motion shots. And when Palpatine is trying to convince and he's reaching out to Rey, take the throne. And there's the slow motion dramatic shots of the Resistance losing to the Sith Eternal. Just fantastic stuff. The moment when Ben arrives and they both go to face off against Palpatine and their lightsabers, both pop up, is another incredible moment in the sequel trilogy that I just absolutely love. I went way longer doing this than I expected. I hope that you enjoyed my ramblings and that at a bare minimum, it provided you a nice positive distraction from everything going on in the world. Share your thoughts with me, though. Again, the Jon Justice, Jon, thejonjustice at gmail.com. If you're used to emailing me, TalkShowNerd at gmail.com, you can, but you're welcome to use the new email address as well. Speaking of that, let's go ahead and dive into a couple of listener feedbacks this week.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, the first one comes from J.O.B., who says this: I don't rank the Star Wars movies and TV. To me, it's all one story. Yeah, man, I'm down with that. A T.E. writes this: you shouldn't even mention Saltier Than Crate. It's a hateful sub, full stop, full of bigotry and sexism. This goes back to the after show last week, and that was a special request from listener Brian Martin that I sort of do a takedown of that particular piece. And I hear you. I don't go to Saltier Than Crate at all. And I actually copy and paste that when Brian sent me, so I didn't give the sub any clicks. Not that they're making any money off it, but I totally understand what you're saying. Josh Stickles writes this: This is regarding you saying that JJ was partly responsible for Luke in The Last Jedi because he isolated him on the island. Ryan could have just said that Luke left because his Jedi Order failed and Kylo turned, so he went to the first Jedi Temple to learn how to properly remake the Jedi Order and defeat the dark sides because what he did didn't work. I don't blame JJ at all for Luke in The Last Jedi. I don't blame JJ for Luke in The Last Jedi because I like Luke in The Last Jedi. You make a good point. I'll give you the relevancy of that point. That's a true statement. Rian Johnson could have done that, but he didn't. And for me personally, again, being subjective, I like what Rian Johnson did. It may have gone counter to what a lot of people's headcanon was of Luke Skywalker. No offense, that's cool. But I thought that it made a more compelling story, and ultimately we ended up getting that all-powerful Luke at the end when he pulled off the best movie he ever could have pulled by projecting himself from Ahch-To to Crate in facing off against Kylo Ren in order to allow the Resistance to leave. All indication, though, is from what most people have said with regard to the way that Lucas was going to write that sequel trilogy, that was his plan too, to make Luke a bit of a hermit and to isolate him. Watching the documentaries over again, which I have been over the past couple of weeks, it's interesting to hear that, Mark Hamill did have a hard time, especially if you watch the director and the Jedi from The Last Jedi bonus material. But how even Ron Bergman, who is the producer with Rian Johnson, he said, Luke thought that he was going to be, Mark Hamill thought he was going to be the all-powerful Jedi and didn't realize that he was going to actually be the Obi-Wan Kenobi of this trilogy. But I thought that, look, I know Mark Hamill disagreed. A lot of people fundamentally disagree with the way Rian Johnson handled it. But man, talk about a true professional in Mark Hamill who, even though he fundamentally disagreed, still went along with what Rian Johnson wanted to do. And I've got nothing but respect for Mark Hamill with regard to that, about how he didn't agree, but he still put his best acting foot forward, and I thought did an amazing job in all three of the films, even for the little bit that he was in the Force Awakens. All right, that wraps up the show this week. I can't believe I actually went 50 minutes. I thought this was going to be 20 minutes long, for crying out loud. Email, again, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, or you can use the new one, the Jon Justice, JON, at gmail.com. I need reviews for my EMBARK trilogy. So if you've purchased any of the EMBARK stories and have not gone to Amazon yet and left a positive review, please go and do so. It would really help me out. Reviews are crucial when it comes to self-publishing and selling future books. And I have a decent amount on book 1, but I definitely need more for books 2 and 3, even though 3 was just released. If you have not picked up the books yet, go get yourself a copy. You can get them in ebook, paperback, and audiobook. The audiobook for book 3 should be available here as soon as Audible. I would think sometime this coming week Audible will approve it. But all 3 versions of the book are available. Book 1 is slightly discounted for those to get into the series, so go and check that out. It's how you can go and support this show. Book 4, which I won't spoil. If you've read book 3, you got the title of it at the end of the book. It's finished. We're moving into the editing phase. Really excited to get this book out there. It's a side adventure. It's an EMBARK adventure. It does take place next in the EMBARK series timeline. Written in first person. It's a lot of fun, and I think a lot of people are really going to enjoy it. Even those that aren't necessarily into the space opera, the big epics of what the original trilogy trilogy for EMBARK is. This is going to be a really fun story, I think, for a lot of people. A little bit shorter than the other stories I've written, but I'm really thrilled with how it turned out, and I can't wait to get it out there. So email me, thejonjustice@gmail.com. Go pick yourself up a copy of books 1, 2, and 3 at mynerdworld.net, or just go to Amazon and look for EMBARK, Jon, Jon Justice. Talk to you again next week. Stay healthy. Stay safe. We'll get through all of this, and I'm really glad you took time this week to check the show out. Like and subscribe wherever you listen to the show, especially on if you watch or listen on YouTube. Subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it. Have yourself a fantastic week. Thanks for the support when it comes to My Nerd World and the EMBARK books, and I'll talk to you again next week. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.